The moment the entire room held its breath, he realized there was no turning back. The 5 wealthy heiresses, seated in gilded chairs, watched his every move as if they already knew the outcome. But no one imagined that, right there in the corner, with the tray still trembling in her hands, the humble waitress would be the center of it all. She kept her gaze downcast, trying to disappear among flower arrangements worth more than a year's salary. And it was precisely when one of the millionaires smashed a glass on the floor just to humiliate her that something inside him broke too. The father, seeing his son walking towards the waitress, frowned as if witnessing a crime. But the mystery began when he touched her arm and whispered something no one could hear, something that made the waitress pale, as if an ancient secret had been ripped from the past at that very second. The entire room leaned forward, awaiting the revelation that would transform that dinner into an indelible scandal. Before we delve into this amazing story, tell me which city and state you're watching from. Leave a comment and I'll reply with gratitude. And while you're at it, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and like this video. We want to share more stories like this. The mansion's main hall was immersed in a combination of luxury and tension, as if every detail had been arranged not only to impress guests, but to test who could survive that suffocating atmosphere of wealth. Enormous chandeliers poured golden light onto a dining table that looked more like a movie set, with silverware aligned to the millimeter and floral arrangements that occupied so much space that it was difficult to see who was on the other side. The 5 heiresses were seated in luxurious chairs, each in a rehearsed posture, as if they were playing perfect characters for the role of future mother of the millionaire's grandchildren. They smiled with perfectly aligned teeth, impeccable clothes, calculated makeup, every movement measured to convey power. And while their expensive perfumes dominated the air, the humble waitress circulated among them with careful steps, holding the tray with crystal glasses as if carrying something more fragile than fate itself. The simple clothes she wore contrasted sharply with the surrounding glitz, and her downcast gaze was like a desperate attempt to hide in a setting that seemed not to have been made for her. The millionaire's son, sitting beside his father, observed everything in silence, not seeing appearances, but the way each of those women treated those they were serving. With each mocking laugh, each sideways glance, each impatient gesture directed at the waitress, he felt something inside him stir, as if he were silently testing the character of each one. It was precisely in that controlled and arrogant environment that the first spark of the story arose, when one of the heiresses lazily raised her hand to call the waitress, as if summoning a trained animal. She pointed to her glass, twisted her mouth, and murmured something almost inaudible but laden with contempt. The waitress approached quickly, holding her breath to avoid trembling. But the rich woman's gesture was too abrupt. The glass tilted, fell from the tray, and shattered into pieces on the floor. The sharp sound echoed through the room like a silent gunshot, and for a second everything stopped. The heiress laughed. It wasn't a light laugh, nor a nervous laugh. It was a calculated, cold laugh, aimed at hurting. She looked at the floor, then at the waitress, and finally at the millionaire, as if to say, "See how incompetent she is." The young man's father opened his mouth to reprimand the employee, but his son couldn't wait. He stood up silently, walked slowly to where the glass had fallen, and bent down to help pick up the shards. The gesture left everyone paralyzed. The waitress tried to stop him, but he only shook his head in a silent request to let him do it. The heiresses exchanged ironic glances, unable to perceive that in that exact gesture, their fate was being sealed. The father frowned, bothered by the fact that his son was in that position in front of everyone, but could only observe without understanding the depth of what was happening. The waitress, in turn, blushed with shame because she never imagined that someone from the family would bend down to clean that up with her. And it was at that moment that the son realized with absolute clarity the first truth that would change the entire course of that night. Character doesn't shine like gold, but it reveals itself in the moments when no one expects anything from you. When the son finally stood up, holding the pieces of the glass in his hands, he looked directly at the wealthy women and realized that none of them seemed truly affected by what he had witnessed. Some continued chatting as if nothing had happened. Others observed the waitress as if she were responsible for an unforgivable crime. This contrast ignited a kind of light within him that could no longer be extinguished. The waitress tried to thank him, but her voice failed her, and she merely bowed her head in respect before returning to work. The son, however, continued to follow her with his gaze, analyzing every reaction invisible to that arrogant audience. He noticed something that no one else perceived: the way she dodged the guests so as not to disturb them, the care she took in discreetly adjusting the position of a bottle that was about to fall, the silent way she rearranged things unseen to keep everything running. Meanwhile, the heiresses competed with each other in superficiality, showing off jewelry, telling stories of international travels, comparing trivialities. With each word spoken, the son felt he didn't belong in that empty, gilded world, and as he observed the waitress, as out of place as he was, he felt something even deeper forming, the understanding that perhaps the most important choices in life weren't made based on appearance, but on the silent impact someone left when they believed no one was watching. And it was with this growing certainty that he realized with a tightness in his chest that the night was only beginning, and that this waitress, trying to be invisible, would be the central piece of a chapter that no one in that room would dare forget. As the dinner progressed into its second course, the atmosphere seemed even more tense, as if the entire room was being slowly compressed by an invisible force, testing the limits of everyone present. The heiresses continued vying for attention, now trying to impress the millionaire with stories of businesses they had inherited, not built. They laughed loudly, clinked glasses, called employees over as if they were decorative objects, and everything in their behavior made it clear that they weren't there to form a family. They were there to win a living trophy, a billionaire son. Meanwhile, the young man observed every detail with eyes no longer fooled by superficial glint. He perceived the disguised impatience, the arrogance ingrained in their gestures, the way they tossed their own resumes as if they were war medals, when in reality they were merely reflections of what their parents had built for them. But what truly held his attention was the waitress, who continued to work impeccably despite the previous humiliation. There was a quiet dignity in the way she moved, as if she carried in her hands a discipline shaped not by status, but by the real need to survive. And her son, who had grown up surrounded by luxury, had never seen someone so resolute in such a hostile environment. He followed her every step, noticing small things that no one else valued: the way she discreetly straightened a crumpled napkin, how she collected empty glasses without interrupting conversations, how she quickly wiped up crumbs without anyone noticing. All of this revealed not only competence, but character, something rare in that room, saturated with pretension. And as he observed, he began to realize that that night would leave deep marks. Because there, amidst that suffocating luxury, someone humble was showing more greatness than the 5 women handpicked by her father to appear perfect. The millionaire father, perched on his pedestal of authority, grew increasingly impatient with his son's demeanor, who showed no enthusiasm for any of the heiresses. He tried to conduct the conversations like a conductor, insisting on controlling all the instruments, but whenever he brought up a topic, the young man responded with cold politeness, averting his gaze to the waitress. This began to provoke intense discomfort among the wealthy guests, who sensed that something was getting out of control. One of them, irritated by the lack of attention, decided to use the waitress as a tool for provocation. She slammed her glass on the table and called the waitress over in a loud, almost aggressive voice. The waitress approached quickly, trying to maintain her composure, but the heiress, with a venomous smile, pointed to her sleeve. "It's stained," she said disdainfully, as if pointing out an unforgivable flaw. The waitress simply nodded, without the right to respond. The heiress, satisfied, continued, "That's why certain people stay where they are. Lack of care." It was as if the phrase had been thrown like a stone into the middle of the room. The silence that followed was dense. The young man's father laughed discreetly, as if supporting the observation. The others laughed too, complicit in the same prejudice. But the son closed his eyes for a moment, inspired by a growing indignation that seemed finally to take shape. He saw the waitress's face tremble, not with anger, but with shame. And at that moment, something inside him blossomed like a natural instinct for protection, as if he recognized in that woman a value that no one there had the sensitivity to perceive. After taking a deep breath, the young man stood up calmly, which caught everyone's attention. He walked slowly to the waitress, leaving a reverent silence behind him. The guests followed him with their eyes, speculating whether he would reprimand her. But when he stood beside her, something changed in the air. He touched her arm carefully, as if asking permission to enter an emotional territory that did not belong to him. The touch was gentle, yet firm enough to make her look up. In that instant, there was a silent exchange between them, a kind of mutual understanding that couldn't be explained in words, only felt. And it was precisely that small spark, that moment as subtle as it was powerful, that began to crack the perfect mask of those arrogant heiresses. What no one noticed, however, was what was going on behind the waitress's gaze. She wasn't just a humble employee trying to survive. There was something deeper, more hidden, that she never expected to surface that night. While the millionaire's son stood there too close, she felt her breath catch for a second, not out of fear of him, but because of the secret she had carried for years, a secret that involved that very family. When he whispered something earlier that no one heard, the shock she felt didn't just come from the physical proximity or the unusual kindness he showed. It came from the recognition, and that recognition put her on alert, as if the past were about to knock on the door again. But she took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. She knew that any slip would put her at risk. She also knew that the young man's father would never accept her presence near his son. So when the young man positioned himself beside her to indirectly confront the heiresses, she felt two opposing emotions pulsing in her chest. One was gratitude, the other was fear. Gratitude because someone finally saw who she truly was. Fear because if he really chose her, the past she had buried with such effort would resurface, and his family might be destroyed because of it. However, even trying to distance herself emotionally, she couldn't look away. When the young man said in a firm voice, loud enough for everyone to hear, "She deserves more respect than all of you put together." The sentence fell like a judgment. The five heiresses' eyes widened. The young man's father's eyes widened even more, and at that moment, the entire course of that night shifted, as if someone had pushed the gears of history onto an irreversible path. And that was just the end of the second segment, blessed, because the real confrontation, the final revelation, and the choice that tears everything apart are yet to come. The silence that filled the room after the young man's words was so thick it seemed almost solid, as if it could be touched. The waitress, still motionless beside him, tried to control her breathing while gripping the tray tightly to prevent her hands from trembling. The heiresses, offended by the unexpected audacity, exchanged glances, searching for a response that would restore control to the group accustomed to dominating everything around them. But each of them realized that, for the first time that night, they weren't just competing with each other. They were losing to someone who wasn't even part of the competition. The father, realizing the direction the situation was taking, rose from his chair with a brusque movement that echoed with the sound of his legs dragging on the marble floor. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and anger, as if his son had committed a grave offense by defending someone he considered insignificant. He took 2 firm steps toward them, and the tension in the room intensified, as if everyone there awaited the impact of an imminent emotional explosion. When he finally reached his son, his gaze met not pure disobedience, but something even worse for him: conviction. And this conviction irritated him more than any direct affront. In a low voice but sharp as a blade, he said, "You are shaming this family." But the son neither recoiled nor looked away. He took a deep breath and calmly replied, "No, father. I am showing that respect is non-negotiable, even when we are surrounded by gold." The young man's words not only surprised his father, but also struck each guest like a collective electric shock. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others tried to feign indifference, but no one could completely divert their attention from the confrontation. The heiresses watched their father expectantly, believing he would immediately put his son back in his place, re-establishing the rigid hierarchy that had always governed that social circle. But the millionaire, although he wished to do so instantly, perceived something in his son's behavior that made him hesitate for a second. It was the first time he had seen him so firm, so decisive, so oblivious to any external judgment. And this unexpected posture disconcerted him. The son, taking advantage of this brief hesitation, stepped forward, positioning himself between his father and the waitress, as if protecting something too fragile to be touched by the arrogance of that environment. "I know you want the best for me," he continued, "but there is no solid future built on people who treat others like garbage." The heiresses, now feeling the weight of the words, began to feel uneasy, some rolling their eyes, others crossing their arms as if needing to reaffirm their superiority. The father, however, reacted with a bitter laugh. "And you think she," he pointed to the waitress with a rude gesture, "represents the best for you, an employee?" The son took a deep breath, as if preparing for a revelation that would change the course of the evening. "She represents something you forgot a long time ago," he said, "character." The waitress, silent until that moment, felt her chest tighten unbearably. Never in her life had she imagined being at the center of such a huge dilemma involving power, reputation, and such deep emotions. But at that instant, she knew she needed to speak, even if her voice trembled. She gently lifted the tray, placed it on the nearest table, and took a deep breath. "Sir," she began, looking at the young man's father, "I never meant to cause any trouble. I'm only here to work and leave at the end of the night. I don't belong in this world, and I shouldn't even be mentioned in this way." Her tone was humble, yet imbued with a dignity that no one there could ignore. She glanced quickly at the young man, with a look that mixed gratitude and fear. "I don't deserve to be used as a weapon in any family fight." But before she could finish, the father interrupted irritably. "Exactly. Finally, something sensible." He turned his back on her as if discarding an unwanted object, but his son's reaction was immediate. "You're not going to turn your back on her as if she were invisible," he said firmly. For the first time, the waitress realized she wasn't alone in that room. There was someone willing to see beyond her uniform, beyond her job, beyond her label. The father, realizing he would lose control if he let it continue, decided to play his final card. He asked all the heiresses to stand and come closer. He positioned himself among them like a gala presenter and said, "These are women chosen from the most important families in the country. They have education, influence, resources, and you need to choose one of them to form something solid, not an illusion." The young man listened without interrupting, but no longer saw any of it as a real presentation. He saw it as a showcase of products that didn't interest him. When the father finished, he extended his hand for his son to approach and make his choice. The guests held their breath. The heiresses raised their chins, regaining their composure. But the son didn't move towards them. He turned slowly and walked to the waitress. The entire room seemed to contract, as if the air had been sucked out. The father's eyes widened. The heiresses let out muffled exclamations, and the guests leaned forward in disbelief. The young man stopped before her, extended his hand, and said in a firm, clear, and devastatingly simple voice, "I choose you." The waitress felt her legs weaken. The shock was so great that for a moment she forgot how to breathe. "No, you can't," she murmured, almost voiceless. "Your father will never accept it. And there's something you don't know." The son frowned, brought his face a little closer, and said softly, "Then tell me." She closed her eyes, fighting against the truth she had kept for years, and finally confessed, "I worked at your mother's house. I saw what she went through, and I promised her I would never get close to you." This revelation fell like a thunderclap. The father, upon hearing it, was completely paralyzed. His expression crumbled, as if something visceral had been ripped from him. The son, however, gently held the waitress's chin and said, "If you took care of my mother, then you've always been part of our family." The phrase reverberated so strongly that even the guests stood motionless. The father brought his hand to his face, feeling the weight of years of wrong decisions. The heiresses backed away, realizing they no longer had a place in that story. And the waitress, for the first time, let the tears fall, not from fear, but because finally someone saw her as a whole human being. The young man embraced her, with the entire room witnessing. And in that moment, it became clear that there wasn't enough wealth in the world capable of buying what she possessed, and that he had finally found not a wife chosen for her status, but someone who carried truth in her heart. The choice was made, and no one in that room would ever forget what they witnessed that night.